Most people remember I Am Legend as a pretty simple movie. One man, the end of the world, and monsters hunting him down in the dark. But I think that's only the version that you see on the first watch. Because the more I think about Neville, the more I start seeing this movie differently. And once you notice this one detail the movie keeps repeating, a lot of scenes begin to challenge the way you felt about them the first time. And later, it completely changes how the ending plays out. Because yes, on the surface, Neville at first appeared to be the last man left alive. He's alone, he's trying to survive, and the infected seem like exactly what he says they are. But think about the way Neville captures them, studies them, and keep assuming they're nothing but mindless creatures. The real question is, what if the movie is showing us a man who understands the apocalypse less than he thinks he does? Because once you strip away Neville's point of view, the infected do not always behave like random and mindless monsters. They set traps, they react to each other, and more than once they move with a kind of purpose Neville never fully acknowledges. And that matters, because if they are thinking more clearly than he wants to believe, then some of Neville's actions start feeling less like survival and more like intrusion. So before we even get to the ending, the first thing we need to ask is, how many times is this movie quietly showing Neville being wrong and we just go along with him anyway? And one of the clearest moments is the trap. Because this is not a random attack. He walks out, sees the mannequin placed there, freezes, and then gets caught in something that had to be set up ahead of time. That means somebody watched him, somebody studies his routine, somebody knew exactly where to place the bait. And even after that, Neville still falls back on the same assumption that these are just mindless creatures acting on instinct. But if they can track him, predict him, and lure him in, then the movie is already showing us something very different from what Neville keeps insisting is true. So the next question is, if the trap proves he is underestimating them, why does he keep refusing to update the way he sees them? And the trap is not the only time the movie does this. Later, Neville captures a female infected and brings her back for another experiment. Then the Alpha shows up, and what stands out is that his reaction does not feel random. He's responding to something Neville did. There is anger there, but there is also pain, a sense of losing something valuable to him, someone he has to get back no matter what. That is what starts to make the whole situation feel different, because now the movie is not just hinting that the infected can plan, it is hinting that they can care. And if they can care, then Neville is not just fighting off monsters, he's interfering with something he still does not fully understand. Because at that point, you have to ask, if the movie keeps showing Neville signs like this, why is he still so certain that he is the one seeing clearly? And this is where Neville's certainty starts to matter a lot more. Because even after the trap, even after the way the Alpha responds, he still treats the infected the same way. He captures them, he tests on them, he talks about them like they are a problem to solve. And that is the part that starts to feel unsettling. Not just that he might be wrong, but that he never slows down long enough to seriously question whether he is. Which leads to the bigger question, if Neville is this certain all the way through, what exactly does the movie want us to feel when that certainty finally gets tested? And maybe this is where the movie starts holding up a mirror to us, the audience. Despite the growing signs that things are not the way they seem, most of us still subconsciously side with Neville. We trust what he sees, we trust how he labels them, we trust the category he puts them in. And maybe the uncomfortable part is that this is not just about him being wrong. It is about how reluctant we are to question his certainty. Because what is it in us that makes that version feel so easy to accept? Is it that his humanity makes him more relatable to us? That seeing ourselves in him makes it easier to stay on his side? Is it the fear of the unknown pushing us so deeply into survival that there is no room left for anyone else? Or is it something worse? That the moment we stop seeing another being as fully real, almost anything starts feeling easier to justify. And if that is true, then maybe the movie is not only asking whether Neville understands the infected, maybe it is asking what happens to us when fear makes certainty feel more comfortable than understanding. And this is why the ending matters so much, not because it suddenly introduces a new idea, but because it forces everything we have been seeing so far to mean something. By the time the movie gets there, the real question is no longer whether Neville is brave or whether the infected are dangerous. It is whether Neville has been reading the situation wrong from the very beginning. Because if trapping Neville showed planning, and the Alpha rescuing the female infected showed attachment, then the ending is where his certainty has to face an uncomfortable truth. And once the movie gets to that point, you can feel it pressing towards something bigger. What if Neville thinks he is defending humanity, when really he no longer knows how to recognize it? And maybe that is the more unsettling possibility that the movie keeps circling around. That the infected are not just monsters, they may be some new emerging branch of humanity, still carrying traces of what we recognize, such as love, loss, attachment, the instinct to protect one another, and yet already becoming something very different from us. They cannot stay in the sunlight, they have lost speech, or at least the kind of speech we understand. So much of what made them familiar is gone, and yet some part of it still remains. Because the movie keeps hinting that somewhere inside all of that change, there is still memory, still connection, still the shadow of a self. It is almost like looking at a version of humanity stripped down and forced into some harsh new stage of existence. Not less alive, not necessarily less feeling, just harder for us to recognize as one of our own. And maybe that is what makes them so disturbing. Not just that they are different, but that they are different in ways that still leave behind pieces of us. And maybe that is the real horror underneath I Am Legend. Not that humanity disappeared, but that it may have changed into something unfamiliar, and we were too frightened, too proud, or too limited to accept it, especially when this newness comes at the expense of our very existence, where its survival leaves ours hanging in the balance. Our empathy narrows, our fear takes over, and the need to survive starts becoming an excuse to stop recognizing the life in front of us. That is what makes the movie linger. Not just the loneliness, not just the monsters, but the possibility that the line between human and inhuman is far more fragile than we want to believe. And that maybe the greatest flaw in our humanity is this, that the moment something no longer feels familiar to us, we become capable of denying that it was ever human at all. If you enjoyed this analysis, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next video.